It's time to hop over to our wonderful panel for some introductions. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. If you could each give me a 2-minute introduction as I call out your name, that would be greatly appreciated. Andreas, I'm going to pick on you first, if that's okay.
Yeah, my name, Andreas Wuchner. I'm doing now, I think, 26 years of all kind of forms and different forms of cybersecurity. Had the pleasure to do RANT events before, came from the life science world through the banking world, do all kind of stuff, being a CISO, being a head of governance, controls and all that stuff. So my world is IT security and risk management. Do a lot of work with startup companies, as you may have heard before. And, whenever when I was asked to really come here on this panel to talk about controls and risk management, this is super close to my heart. And so I'm really, really looking forward to the discussion. I just looked through the list of attendees and I'm really happy already see some familiar names. So welcome the Swissies here and the UK ones. And yeah, I'm looking forward to all of that. And I think that's pretty much about me.
Thanks, Andreas. That's much appreciated. Andy, over to you.
So I'm Andy Jaquith. I'm the Chief Security Officer of Complex, where I'm responsible for CISO things. I'm also the head of the cyber business unit there. My prior roles included being global head of cyber risk for JP Morgan Chase, which is a second line function with oversight over information risk and cyber controls. And then prior to that, MD at Goldman Sachs, where I was the head of the continuous controls monitoring team with, among other things, things like vuln management and SOX technology certification and things of that nature. So great to be with everybody today. Looking forward to a lively panel conversation. I know I think we all know each other because we're on the advisory board, most of us together. So it should be good fun. Thanks for having me.
Lovely. Thanks for that, Andy. David, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Tom. I'm David Fairman. Probably for the past year now, I've been working more in the tech space. So I'm the Chief Security Officer here in APAC for Netscope, and I'm also a partner in a venture capital fund called 630. We invest in fintech, digital health, and cybersecurity companies. Prior to that, a long time banking and finance, cybersecurity guy. So having been the Chief Security Officer at National Australia Bank, running all things security, fraud, physical security. Prior to that, Group CISO at Royal Bank of Canada, JP Morgan before that, and 2 CISO roles with Royal Bank of Scotland in the Americas and in EMEA. So long time banking finance guy, a little bit of critical infrastructure before that, and then defence prior to that. So been in the cyberspace for, I guess, 20 odd years, mostly banking and finance, and now find myself working with startups and the innovation and tech space. So it's been a good past year for me. And thanks for having me on the panel this morning.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Dave. Great. That takes us on to James, if that's okay.
Yes, thank you very much. Jim Doggett. I'm currently the CISO at another startup, similar path that Dave Fairman has taken, a startup called Semperis, who deals in the Active Directory space. Prior to that, I've spent most of my career at EY, and from there I went to the head up security for one of the divisions at JP Morgan, and from there went to Kaiser Permanente and headed up a technology risk and security there, and did the same thing at AIG for 3 years with technology and security and risks. So big fan of the space of security and risk and as it merges together, and look forward to talking a little bit about that on the metric that I'll be talking about today. But welcome everyone to the event today, and hopefully you guys enjoy this.
Lovely. Thanks for that, Jim. And Raf, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Rafael Marti. I've spent about 2 decades in cybersecurity. Andreas, I'm right on your heels. I've worked at all kinds of places, from startups to large organizations. I actually started my career back in Switzerland at IBM Research, and go Switzerland for the soccer Euro Cup. We're doing good there. I've always worked at the general intersection of data and security. So been dealing with big data. Back in the day, it was a lot of data. It wasn't called big data, but dealt with that for a long time in the security space. Currently, I head up security products at a company called ConnectWise. We're a platform for technology service providers. So these are companies that are delivering services to mostly small and medium businesses. And it's, for us, the core is really to build products that are super simple to use for these smaller companies across all of our product lines and managed services. I've been part of the security metrics community for a long time, back in the early 2000s when Andy here wrote the book on the security metrics, and been part of that community for a long time, thinking about what does it mean to measure security and what are good metrics and so on. So super excited to have to be part of this panel here to discuss the topic today.
Lovely. Thanks for that, Raf. And great. That is pretty much everything. We're going to move across to Andreas once I've laid a little bit more groundwork ahead of the discussion, and we can get started. So we're going to be talking about critical security metrics to protect an enterprise. It's going to be a panel discussion with these wonderful industry leaders. Hopefully you'll have got a little bit of idea about where they've come from, and maybe a couple of hints for the eagle-eyed on which they might be focusing on. All have been contributors to the Metric of the Month series, working with Panaseer previously, talking about best security metrics, collaborating with top security and risk pros to share security metrics and measurement best practices, highlighting items especially interesting and valuable to security teams. Our collaborators share insight and wisdom they have built over the years of experience in major enterprise. So we're going to work through each person who will take a swing at their favorite for cybersecurity metric. I'll then put it back to the other panelists so that they might be able to contribute and maybe counterpoint. We'll then roll on to the next speaker and so on and so forth until we get to the end where we'll be working through the question and answers. So I'm going to move back to you, Andreas, now, if you wouldn't mind. Could you start by defining what makes a good security metric in your eyes?
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, I think everyone who looks into the whole world of risk management will come to the point that it's all about controls and how to measure their effectiveness, right? And, to find controls is relatively easy. We have tons of standards out there, being NIST, being ISO, being the security control framework, where, for example, the SCF has 11 controls for awareness. So, but what is it? It's just text, right? It's just how to measure. How is it really that you can say with a good feeling this control is effective or not? And believe it or not, I have plenty of contacts with CISOs, and we talk about risk management. And very, very often you hear people talking about key performance indicators when it comes to measuring controls. And they don't understand that this whole control space is far more than just performance indicators. It's not about 99.995%, right? It's a multitude of things which makes or defines a control being effective or not. And a KPI is maybe one of them. A key performance indicator, a key risk indicator, maybe a separate one. An assessment type, another one, right? And all this stuff together makes then a control effectiveness measurement. And so whenever we talk about metrics and control effectiveness, it is first to really agree on the set of measurements we take, the set of metrics we take to look at what makes a control effective. The second thing is to really look at the data sources we are getting it from, right? So hopefully in an automated fashion, and to really say, look here, how can we get this so that it's not people dependent? And then comes the third one where it says, look, if it's automated and we know what we look for, what is the threshold? What do we measure? And what defines good? And that's where often the things go ballistic, right? Because the IT ops people say, oh, no, don't be too harsh, right? It still needs to be workable. But the risk people say, no, we really need tight controls. I don't want to run a tight ship. And that's why it's so important that for proper control assessment, it's not one, but very seldom just one metric. I have a multitude of metrics. Be clear what the metrics are, what gives you the complete overview. Be very clear on how to get the data and watch out for the data quality, and be super clear what the threshold is. And if you do these three minimal things, you get to a point where you get data together, which really is meaningful, because in your set, which you have defined, you may have different priorities, right? You say maybe this performance indicator is important, but it's only priority 3. But the one number which we have, which is a risk indicator, is far more higher. So you can balance it out and you get a complete end-to-end picture. So important is, for me, and that's just my humble opinion, right? If you talk about control effectiveness, get clarity on what you measure. Get clarity on the data quality, get clarity on the automation, and get agreement on the priorities and thresholds. And with that together, you have a really good start. And you can start small, right? You don't need to heal the world. And you also can start with a handful of NIST controls. You don't need to go through 500 controls to get an end-to-end view. Get an overview, make sure that you cover everything and measure it, and use automation. Get out of that game that you have people sending you Excels or PowerPoints, which you manually integrate. Nonsense. It's a road to failure. Start small, start automated, and you will have a good success story overall. And that's, if you follow these kind of basic standards, we get to a very good start, and we can grow, right? Less is more, and grow over time is the better approach for me.
Lovely stuff. Well, thank you for that, Andreas, for providing a beautiful foundation upon which everyone will now be able to talk through their favorite metrics. I'm going to come straight back to you now so that you can tell me exactly why you think that cyber awareness is your favorite cyber or risk metric.
Cyber awareness is, for me, a favorite one because it's so hard to do. You know, technology is often relatively easy to measure, but the human factor is very, very difficult most of the time. You see everywhere now human cyber risk discussion, cultural change programs. And when you look, because I'm very much enthusiastic about this human cyber risk topic, I've chosen this one because whenever we talk, or I talk with CISOs and also companies which provide services, when it comes to cyber culture, most of the companies measures click rates in phishing, or they measure 99% or 95% of people have done the mandatory training and awareness stuff, what they have, you know, all that stuff. And this is click and tick the box, right? This is not really cyber culture. And so therefore, what it is for me there is really to say, look, guys, we see more and more and more ransomware attacks everywhere successful. Why is it successful? Because people click. And we as leaders, we address not the behavior of people. We address, oh, yeah, you have done this manner. You know how a complex password looks like, or has to look like. We show the people what good means for us, but we don't address them in a way that it's personal. And the cyber awareness topic for me is therefore a very broad topic. It is very important. 90% of all successful attacks start with people doing mistakes, and not because they are bad or they're stressed, they are under pressure. The phishing mail is done in a really, really good way. And that's why I think getting more clarity around cyber awareness and getting more clarity about the cultural change and the cultural situation in a company is important. And to give you just an example, because you only gave me 6 minutes to talk about this topic, and I see my watch here. One thing is to say, hey guys, this is a complex password, and make the training and be good at it. Okay, good. But what do we know about it? And give you an example there. If I give everyone here on the call 10 questions about cybersecurity, they will go through it, right? They will tick the box. Maybe some meet the minimum thing, 6, and pass. I have no idea if the person did it, or if the kids did it, or the assistant did it. And if I just ask 10 questions and look for the answer, I don't know anything about the culture in the company. But if I start looking at things like, okay, how often did they move around? How long did it take them to answer the question? If I start looking at or asking the question, how confident are you? I get to a point that I see, and this is a real example which I had in my own company, saying, hey, look, I have people, young digital generation, they know everything about cyber because they grow up with cyber, right? They feel very confident. They go to the 10 questions, click, 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 ask the question, confident, super confident. And surprise, surprise, at the end, they may got to 6, but out of 10, so they passed the test. But what I know in the background is, okay, they are super confident, they are super bullish, but they don't care, right? Because they're doing the same mistakes. They think they know everything better, but in reality, they're just as average as everyone else. And with this information at hand, I all of a sudden see, okay, if I get new joiners of the Generation X, I better do a different training, because otherwise they will become my biggest risk factor later on, because they are doomed to make mistakes because they are super confident. Just one example. One other example before I go back to you, Tom, is, we have all policies, we have all standards, and we tell the people, whenever you leave your workstation, lock your workstation. Take out the smart card, just put Control L, it's locked. Now we work all from home. In the office, people were playing around saying, the guy left his smart card in, so stealing, shame the thing and say something. You see something, say something. At home, this is gone. No one sees if my kid is playing on my computer. Okay, my son is 23. I don't know what he does, but that's a very different scenario all of a sudden. So if we start measuring, for example, how often a computer runs into auto lock, I get a pretty good feeling of the people that have done the training. Hopefully they understood it, but they don't give a shit about it, right? Because they just go away and go to the toilet, go to the whatever, right? And keep it in auto run. Most probably they do the same if they're at the Starbucks coffee, right? Because we have a complete new way of working. So smart measuring, getting the data which we have available and get more context about the culture and the behavior in a company makes a difference. And that's why I think this is a very, very cool area and an area to invest in for every company, because there are low-hanging fruits. They will learn a lot, and they will most probably be able to get to a point that people care and train them on the things which are important, not one fit all groups. Some groups are more open from failures. Some are more affected because they have more kind of dangerous communications. And that allows me to reduce cost, do more targeted stuff, and get overall a much better security place for the company.
Lovely. Thank you for that, Andreas. That was a solid 6 minutes, slightly over that, but you were the first person, so we'll give you it. More importantly, let's put it to the panel, shall we? Let's make this a bit interactive. Gentlemen, you've all listened to Andreas. You've got your own views on cyber awareness. We have 4 minutes to contribute. That's enough time for a couple. Let's go. Who would like to jump in?
I'm going to kick off. Look, I think to make this conversation meaningful, we should probably drill into some of those metrics that we can use to actually measure this, right? So let's talk specifically about some of that. And I am going to challenge some of the thinking around the phishing attempts, right? Because actually I know we all measure phishing attempts, but we're all susceptible to making that mistake in the heat of the moment, right? I know I've done it myself. I've been caught from one of my own team's phishes. It was very sophisticated. It was very, very good, right? I think, but there's also an element in terms of the culture element, because we're talking about cyber awareness, but Andreas, you were very much talking around culture more so than awareness, and I see them as two different things, right? Awareness is we know this stuff. Culture is how people behave and what they do. So let's talk about some things that are really specific that I think are really useful to measure in this, because I agree with you. I think it's a great higher level metric for us to be able to get a perspective on the culture. It's a culture indicator for the organization. So we pick on people clicking on the phishing tests and phishing simulations. Let's talk about the people who are reporting phishing campaigns or phishing tests, because one person reporting a campaign can neutralize an entire campaign. So for me, that reporting rate is probably more important than the click-through rate. We're always going to have, whenever there's humans involved, there's always going to be a manual error or some form of opportunity for a mistake to happen. Let's frame it that way. So what are those preventative things that we really want to drive and reward? I also look at things like, we all do user entitlement reviews across our organization, and generally we'll have some form of, SLA. We want those user entitlement reviews to be performed and executed. So I use them as a measure of culture. Like, are you achieving a 99% action rate within SLA of people doing user entitlement reviews? If you're seeing a measure where people aren't hitting it on time, they aren't doing it, you're not getting a high closure rate, for me, that's an indicator of people's attitude to the importance of it or lack of importance to this. So those sorts of metrics I think are really, really important. So it's about how do you aggregate these more detailed metrics and give that more of a culture rating. I think another good metric is around data leakage events. Now, we all have some form of data leakage process within our organization. We generally escalate to a line manager that line manager needs to respond in some way, shape or form. I measure the response rate to those sorts of things. How many of your security teams have to go out and chase things up multiple times because they're not getting a response? For me, these are really good measures or indicators of culture across that organization. And then we want to think about what do we do for that? So, let's identify some of those high-risk users. I think it's really good. And there's some great capabilities out there now, some great tools out there that will actually measure people's behaviors in that point in time, in that moment, through signals from other security tools. And it allows them, it does micro nudges or points in time training and coaching events. And I think, once we can start to aggregate some of that stuff up, we can identify some of these high-risk users. But what do we do with those high-risk users at that time? It's great to identify them, but if you really want to talk about changing people's behaviors, you have to talk about consequence, because if there's no consequence, people won't change their behavior. There's nothing in it for them. You can go and tell them as much as you like, but there needs to be a consequence. So is that restricted access on the network, restricted access on the internet? Is it tied into their performance review? Is it an impact to their, to their bonus expectations? And how do you reward the positive activity as well, right? And how do you acknowledge that? So I think those two things are really, really important. But these metrics give you that view of people behavior across that organization more broadly, and that becomes an indicator of culture across that organization.
Spot on, right? Can't agree more. Especially the discussion I have often is, how should you react to? Should you punish people or should you reward people, right? So you have often the black and white discussions, right? So to have a balancer is very difficult for most organizations. But I'm totally with you. I think we should focus on the reward side and say, look, here there are the advantages. If you behave, that's really cool. And there must be a limit where I say, look here, third time failed this repeated clicker thing, went through the training, still don't give a shit. There needs to be a line in the ground where I say, look, no, it's enough.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about changing behavior, like let's talk about training a dog, to do what you want. You reward it when it does the right thing. It's true, right? And it's this positive reinforcement. Yep, it needs to be both a negative consequence and a positive consequence depending on the behavior. And we need to be very balanced. Otherwise, it becomes a very draconian organization, and that sets a bad cultural tone across the organization, which is not where we want to be. So it needs to be balanced.
Look, I think I agree with both of you, but I would throw another one in there, which is we need to offload the onus of doing these things from the user and build simpler products, right? The policy thing you just said, like you should lock your screen. Why isn't it a policy that after 2 minutes, your screen just locks automatically? Of course, you should lock it right away when you walk away, right? So how can we enforce some of these things, make it easy? Don't get in the way of the user stuff. Don't have 50-character passwords and change them every 2 days, right? But I think on the security product side, we need to get better at that.
absolutely.
Lovely. Well, thank you, gentlemen. That's greatly appreciated. There we are, one done and nearly on time. This is amazing news. Andy, I'm going to jump onto you now. Let's talk about why you think that toxic combinations are your favorite cybersecurity metric.
Yeah. So thanks, Tom. And I'm going to resist the temptation to jump in on the awareness and training things because that's a cool topic that we could spend a lot of time on. I think the point that everybody got was, what I agree with 100%, is that this is a multifaceted problem that transcends simple metrics and requires you to be a lot more holistic. So, but anyway, on toxic combinations. So I did a post with Barnaby at Panaseer on this a little while ago, and the whole notion of toxic combinations is sort of like things that shouldn't go together because they have really unfortunate consequences to the host, right? So there are certain medications, for example, if you read the fine print, it says don't eat grapefruit with this drug, right? Because there's a particular chemical in the grapefruit that interacts with the medication and it causes people to have, cardiac arrest or allergic reactions or things like that. And in the enterprise context, what we really mean is privileges that shouldn't go together because they introduce risks to the organization that are nonlinear. So one example that I don't think of as a toxic combination would be like somebody that simply has too much privilege, right? So like your Windows system administrators, right? They have domain credentials. There's a reason the PAM product sector exists, right? Is to make those privileges less, more infrequently used and locked away when they're not needed. But we accept that the person that has them should have those outsized privileges. The DevOps teams, for example, often have extremely concentrated privileges, but that's part of their job, right? So our job as risk professionals is to make it more safe to do that work with those privileges they possess. Toxic combinations are a slightly different matter, because it refers to people that have a conflict of interest. So, for example, and this often comes up in the institutional context, where you may have a business user and their job is to take positions on behalf of the firm. They're betting the firm's money or they're betting the client's money. If that person also has the ability to, for example, modify code that relates to that system, which means that potentially they might be able to hide their tracks, right, on a trade that they make or a position they took. That's fundamentally an example of a toxic combination. So part of what you do is, and this really requires expert judgment, you want to look at the entitlements that you can grant to a user. And they're, typically admin credentials, business right or sort of power user credentials, and read entitlements, meaning where they can modify very little or they have a very nominal set of privileges. And then the other side of it, typically system oriented. And when you find people that possess both, you just simply need to get rid of them and say it is fundamentally a conflict. And so we're just going to eliminate the conflict by getting rid of one of your sets of privileges. There are occasionally contexts in which this makes sense, like in testing, but those cases should be extremely time limited. But really the important point here is to identify them, to go through and enumerate what those combinations are, and then rigorously systematize how you detect when they're possessed, and then to get rid of them. So I gave one example here around more of a commit or code-based set of entitlements for a system that you might be developing yourself. But for packaged software, having root or all-powerful credentials to a system that might allow you to, for example, add other administrators or add users, and then also to be a user of that system. That's typically something you don't want. An example of this is a little bit poignant for me because my company is in the process of going public, right? So our Sarbanes-Oxley's muscles are starting to get a little more well-toned, right? So we need to be looking at general ledger, right? So your general ledger system that has your books and your records, right? So who's got rights to be able to, who's got the root creds for those? Are they the same as, for example, an approver of expenses or something else, right? So those are the kinds of things that we look for. Again, you can make exceptions, but you need to go in with it with an eyes wide open, and you need to have guardrails around the risk. So that's probably the easiest explanation. I'll just say from prior experience, when I've looked at this in the past, it assumes that you have a way of collecting those entitlements, typically in an automated way, right? It assumes that you then have a way of having a grammar by which you talk about them, right? This is an administrator set of credentials. This is read creds. This is write creds. Business power user, a small set of standard types, and that you can then fuse them together with the identities, and then you can know who those persons are, and that you have a regular process for reviewing them. It's it is almost impossible to conceive of doing this in a manual way, right? So it almost always means that you've got to do this in an automated fashion. With tools, you write them yourself, you buy a package, but frankly, most people will get it wrong if they write it themselves. So, and I'll stop there because I'm sure some of my colleagues have got some views on this too.
Dog, I've got one question sort of for you, and this is an area that I've always struggled with these toxic combinations, and not because you can't identify some, but how do you know when to stop? How do you know when to start? I mean, there just seems like an endless supply of toxic combinations that are out there that you could go forever on. And then once you get them, how do you keep up with all of them? This just in my real life past world. To me, this was a very tough area to cover.
I'll just tell you from my own experience, right? And part of this, practically speaking, what's your scope? Where do you start and stop? And I know this is cynical to say, but right, what's going to get you put in jail, right? Start there, and maybe stop there too. Or enlarge the envelope to things that really could cause a lot of operational risk to you. I think it's the question of how big is the crater. If somebody turned rogue, they get bribed, coerced, or they simply got a bad bonus, right, or a bonus they didn't expect, right? So that's. Yeah. I think what's the damage you can cause is probably where you stop. But yeah, I agree with you. You could go on this forever and ever, and you'll never really stop or be satisfied. But practically speaking, if you can't list practically the number of these things on a sheet of paper, it starts to get hard to. It's hard to justify the expense of it, frankly, and you do make people's lives difficult because you're giving them something else to do in addition to the privilege certification stuff that they're probably doing, which is also probably not what they want to be doing all the time. And you want to make this infrequent enough that they take it quite seriously, and not give them so many things to think about that they have an excuse to sort of hit the snooze alarm and get on with their lives. So that's my practical sense on this.
Thank you.
Andy, you talked quite a bit about sort of the business side of things. On the IT side, what's your take on sysadmin privileges, like root privileges? You have access to everything. So it's like you control the systems, right? That's the one. And the other one is IT controls a lot of these privileges, right? Like, again, the sysadmins have access to provision some of the systems, but I see that often we would want to move that over to the business, right? I own certain Amazon accounts. I should be able to provision these accounts to the right users, kick the users off that I don't think should be on these accounts, but I have to go through IT and they sort of handle it. So any comments on those two topics?
Yeah, I think this is an art, not a science, for sure, right? And again, I'd also welcome some comments from some Andreas, and David in particular, right? But just with the institutional standpoint, I tend to think that like IT should be in the business of granting course entitlements, right? So you're an administrator or you're not. You may have some ordinary user entitlements on the system or you're not. Your SSO system allows you access or not. You can close the front door through a properly constructed SSO system and the like. But within the applications, you really need to defer to the application owners with a workflow that shows that those entitlements are granted to them appropriately, right? That you've got some governing over that privilege granting, but privilege granting ultimately needs to be devolved to the app and the business owners. Where I tend to draw the line, and it's hard because a lot of applications don't allow you to do this, especially the third-party ones, is where you can you don't want I don't want business users entitling other administrators, right? That is where I like admin level privileges to be controlled as centrally as you can, because that way you can at least you have a fighting chance of being able to lock the credentials up so that they're not easily accessible. But that's hard to do. Sometimes the choice isn't quite as binary as subtle as that. It's a binary, all or nothing. But that's so again, just to recap, give the business the opportunity to provide some of these finer grained entitlements. Leave the course granting to IT. Centralize those as much as you can, particularly the deprovisioning side of it.
Lovely. Thank you very much for that, Andy, and thank you, panel. David, I'm going to jump on to your question now. Talk to me about why controls coverage is your favorite cybersecurity metric.
Yeah, look, I think controls, if I think about how do you get assurance and a good understanding and confidence in your overall security program, there's three things that we really want to look at when we're talking specifically about controls. We want to look at adequacy of design of that control. We want to look at the operational effectiveness of that control. And just as importantly, we want to look at the coverage of that control. You can have a control that's designed adequately and operating effectively, but if it's only implemented in a subset of the environment you need to control, clearly you have a gap. So for me, it's a direct indicator of a risk exposure area or of residual risk, right? So and I think, as security professionals, as security teams can relate to, when have we get surprised, we get compromised, we get attacked, we are vulnerable when things happen that we don't know about. If I think about the security world, it's very much it's an event-driven world today. If you see this, do that. Well, if you're relying on a control to be an indicator, a preventative or a detective tool in some way, shape or form, that tool is not implemented, or that control is not implemented where it needs to be, you are not going to see that. You are not going to have the visibility of that for a start. It creates an exposure for you. I think about three key metrics, and when we did this blog, we spoke about it. We spoke about this particular point. There's always three key metrics that I used to, from a cybersecurity perspective, I used to really look at: mean time to detect, mean time to respond, and data leakage events. And if you think of mean time to detect and mean time to respond, that's driven by a number of different metrics. And if you're only assessing, testing, assuring a subset of those metrics, you're not really getting an accurate view of how effective your organization is in that space. Controls coverage clearly comes back to an understanding of your true environment and your asset inventory, or your CMDB, right? And I don't think anybody out there, I would never say that I felt like any of my organizations had, a 100% accurate asset inventory. So what I actually think is controls coverage and, the triangulation of that asset inventory from multiple data elements allows us to get a higher level of confidence across the perspective or the understanding that we have of that true environment and that asset inventory. So I think it becomes a very important metric which drives a lot of other decisions with how we develop and prioritize the security program. So for me, that's probably the most important element. Because it doesn't matter what control we're talking about, you need to know that that's implemented where that should be, where you expect that to be.
Lovely, thank you for that, David. Let's put it to the panel. Any contributions?
I'll give one quick one, at least anyway, to Dave. The controls coverage is it's interesting because really that applies to every control.
Absolutely.
Any control you have in the entire environment, if you aren't getting the coverage, you're wasting your time. And at least from my experience at dealing with boards and senior management, there's no quicker way to get into trouble as a CISO than missing control coverage. They don't want to hear later on, well, we didn't, it's just an excuse they don't buy. At least I have experienced that anyway. So I think this is a big one.
No, I think you're spot on. And actually, if we think about some of the challenges of ensuring that you have accuracy of that element of the controls monitoring program, I think some of the challenges that I've seen practically is, think of subsidiaries. If you work for a large enterprise, a large organisation, you have the CISO of a group of an organisation. You have a number of different subsidiaries. So you have group accountability, but maybe those subsidiaries, your group technology shop does not manage that subsidiary. It's a separate legal entity in some way, shape or form. So how do you start to really drill down and understand, as a group CISO, if we want to call it that, or a group security executive who has accountability for the entire enterprise, not just a legal entity within that enterprise, how do you really understand the security program across the group without truly being able to measure the effectiveness, the design adequacy, the operating effectiveness, and ensuring you have coverage across all the controls across that very complex and disparate organisation. Now, it's a very hard challenge, but actually what it'll drive discussions within your organisation about roles and responsibilities, about operating model, about accountabilities. Because think about it, as a group security executive saying, well, hang on, I know this part of the organisation, but I don't have the visibility or accountability or support I need to understand this part of the organisation. That's not good enough. You can't abdicate that responsibility in a group role.
Can I ask you a question on that, David? There is this discussion, you see everyone goes to the cloud, right? And you have the AWS, the Microsoft Azure. That's the thing which at least you get some kind of a handle on. But there are plenty of business clouds, right, where very specific things are happening, which you as a CISO often don't even know about, right? How do you see this going to happen? Because, you see currently the third-party vendor risk space exploding, right? Because everywhere the insurance premiums go up, everything goes worse. How do you see that? What's the way to address this in future?
Well, I think at the end of the day, it's the control objectives and the controls that you expect within your organisation don't really change. It's regardless of who operates that. So if you're going to a cloud provider, you still need to be clear about how do you measure the security operations within that environment in some way, shape or form. You can't abdicate that responsibility. It's a shared responsibility when you move to the cloud, right? So it's about how do you work with that cloud provider and get the visibility and drive those elements. I think a lot of it really comes back to how well do you see your own inventory. So when app dev teams are spinning up and spinning down workloads, how do you maintain that? How do you monitor that? How do you see that in near real time and then correlate that back to where you expect things to be? How are you defining capability to ensure that when resources, workloads are being spun up, that they're being spun up with the expected controls in place? There are capabilities out there that allow us to do that. So it's about putting policy and driving that. So the security team really becomes this team that defines those guardrails, creates capabilities that are consumed by the app dev teams potentially the infrastructure teams to ensure that these controls, or to ensure that the security posture is being implemented the way that we expect. Now remember, security is code these days, right? Infrastructure is code these days. It's actually really easy to measure code. You can inspect the code directly. You can take it from the repo. You can see what's being commanded in the repo. You can commit that. You can compare that to what's being actually run in real time. So you can start to get a perspective and a handle on that and an insight on that really easily. But you need to take the time to define it and work through that. And I think this is where security organisations need to evolve as well. We need to evolve as application development teams. We need to understand how we can write the checks and balances and write the code to assess the code, right? Expecting to run a tool these days is not adequate and just pull something from a dashboard. We need the ability to be able to write code. We need to be able to write security as code and integrate that into the app dev process or the cloud migration process.
Right.
I think that's so spot on, David. I mean, this is, I think the bigger, I think the broader message here is as security officers, we need to spend a lot more time getting embedded into the app dev processes. If I think just in terms of my own, shall we say, professional hobbies and self-education, about where I've had to put some of my own time in terms of getting further up to speed, it's in directly tinkering with some of these cloud tools such that you can get your head around it, right? If you can't get your head around it and know where you plug in, it's hard to figure out a way to instrument. And so I think these, with the automation of a lot of these cloud workloads, the DevOps teams they're not doing these things, or at least they shouldn't be doing them in a manual way, right? They're going to be building their own tools to build systems, right? And so, and depending on how far you push it, you can go to full merge request, auto deploy, push a new system in 5 minutes, right? That's terrific, but it also means that we've got to plug more deeply into those workloads so that we have, if not points of leverage, then certainly points of measurement that allow us to get a sense of what's going on there. And that's in the era of dynamic compute, is where an asset isn't what it used to be. That's the important bit. So yeah, it's an area just personally where I've been spending a fair bit of my time. So one of the things that some of our folks at Complex are doing is they have what they call a drift detection script that runs on portions of infrastructure, right? Where we look for everything gets terraformed into shape, right? And every night it runs, right? And every night it goes back to its expected state. And that's a great thing to instrument, but it's also a great way of ensuring that things are exactly as you expect them to be. So security as code means we have a lot more opportunities to plug in, to observe, and to assist.
Great. Well, lovely. Thank you, everyone, for your contributions throughout that. Jim, I'm going to jump on to your topic next. Tell me about why outlier analysis is your favorite metric.
It's really vulnerability outlier analysis is the sort of topic for today. And again, I view this as an oldie but a goodie. It's amazing to me we're still dealing with, because at least I assume most of us on the call today, we've been dealing with vulnerabilities, patch management for forever, but why is it still here? And for whatever reason it is, and I think it's still worth talking a little bit about. And to me, it all comes down to 3 words: risk, probably efficiency, and with the efficiency, I think comes automation. 3 things that have probably held us back maybe from, and I'll have to add a 4th one now that Dave's brought up that whole control coverage thing, because that's another big one in this space of vulnerability management too, I think. But anyway, I'm going to go through the scenario of how at least I like to approach vulnerabilities from an outlier perspective, our management perspective. I mean, first, before you get into doing anything else, there's just certain vulnerabilities you got to fix now. The boss tells you to do it, or it's just one that's that big. So let's throw those out off the bat. We're going to take care of those and deal with those as quickly as we can. But then with what's left, how do you want to focus on the ones probably then with higher risk? The interesting part, though, is what do you mean by higher risk? And we all run scanners that comes back with criticals and highs and lows, but that's not risk-based, really. That's inherent risk. It's not the risk that you pose to the company. I mean, it's great that it's a critical risk that you've identified, but if you don't even have that asset in your inventory, it really isn't critical to you. So learning how to first get enough context to these vulnerabilities, which is not a simple thing, and I think it requires automation as well, is sort of step 1. And then once you get to that patch of higher risk, you don't want to fix them all, I assume. At least and a few of you, like Dave, you might be out there and be able to get all the way down to the lows. I've actually never made it probably past the highs anywhere I've been. I wish I could have, but the mediums and lows I never cleared out the higher risk ones there. So once you get there, then how do you deal with it? And that's where this outlier analysis, at least we got into this pretty heavily at a couple places that I worked, and I found it to be pretty effective. And that's where you find the commonalities. Are there certain vulnerabilities that are widespread across your entire enterprise that if you nail one of them, you get a whole lot of bang for the buck for it? Or are there certain machines that that tend to be the dominant, they have large quantities of vulnerabilities that by attacking the machine, you might be able to do things. And again, even looking at the underlying cause of, well, why that machine? Is it that machine because it's a group that's weak at maintaining it? Is it because it's a high critical risk that no one wants to touch and patch ever? There's all kinds of good reasons behind it, but that type of analysis, I think, is sort of critical for this. And then once when you think you sort of have your hands around all that, I think we do come back to, Dave Fairman, your comment, your whole section on coverage. Scanning vulnerabilities is great, but if you're only scanning half the enterprise, it's useless. And I'm a walking testament of that, of going to a board and making the mistake of talking about how much progress I made, only to have to go back and find out that one country put up a firewall and we weren't getting any data from them, and I didn't recognize it, or my team did. We didn't do it again. We were good at that, but the first time through. So I think that's a critical piece. And the other is, how do you speed up remediation? That's once you're getting there, because that seems to be the biggest bottleneck. It's easy for security to say, we'll go patch all these systems and do all these, apply all these, but you can't do that. There has to be testing. They impact the applications that affect the business, and it can be worse patching than not patching. And so the more context that you can add to that data, so you know who owns it, where it is, the better your likelihood, I think at least, of getting it done is. And then I'll talk the last point that I want to do is, you got to find a way to automate this. It's one of the most oldest and basic areas out there. But if each time you do like I used to have to do, where I take the output of a whole 5 different scanners throughout the world, try to consolidate them, eliminate duplication, try to go in then and make sure where I had gaps, where I didn't get coverage, then enrich that data so I know who has it. The month's already over and I'm reporting again before I've even done all that work. So automation, I think, is going to be a key to this area too.
Lovely. Thank you very much for that, Jim. Let's pass it to the panel.
So look, I think yes, clearly, automation is the key there. I completely agree with that, Jim. I'm going to come back to your point around, the low vulnerabilities and going out and doing those patching. So in terms of the metrics that I used to really track, like, you sort of drive your own risk appetite settings through some of that, right? So I didn't measure mediums and lows because there were so many critical and highs in it, and that's what I wanted to focus on, because I really believe in a risk-based approach to how you drive your program. And actually these metrics, think about, I can see Diana Summerscale, she's added a question in there around understanding the principles of defense in depth. If one of your metrics show red, that it's not a total disaster for the company. I think it's really about what it is you're trying to drive by measuring something, right? Is it a behavior you're trying to change? Is it a culture change? Is it an actual, is it a control environment you're trying to get an indication on? And the reason I make that point, and maybe I know that hasn't come out overly articulate, I didn't articulate that very well, but think about that risk-based approach, right? The criticals and the highs are the ones we want to drive on, right? So I expect them to be green, right? And I want my technology teams to be focusing on them. I'm not going to measure everything, right? Even though I can measure everything. So you're going to, I think, through that process, maybe your lows are red for a period of time, but then you think about, well, what does that look like? How do you map it back to what your policy says? So I think vulnerabilities are a really good example because it's really easy to get your hands around, right? Critical, high, mediums, lows. We're saying that every low, maybe we'll patch lows at every OS upgrade, right? So maybe when that gets down, so why are you even measuring that one? Because you're going to expect gaps for a period of time. But you should be you should be measuring the metric based on the expectation of the service or the expectation of the closure of that issue, not at a point in time. Because if you said, okay, we're living with 3 days to close a critical, or we're living with 7 days to close a high, measure that. Because you're always going to have that delay, right? So I think that's really, really important that you think about what's the objective of the metric. And it sort of comes back to Andreas's point about being really clear about what the metric is, how it is defined, and what's the purpose of that to drive some of those things. So I think that's, and coming back to the outlier analysis, For me, that was it. We can't fix everything. And actually, I think outlier analysis and clustering analysis is really, really important because it gives a view of the state of your organisation, the current state of your organisation, and from that you can start to derive where do you want to get to. Based on where I am today, where do I want to get to? I want to maybe we're seeing a cluster which is showing an indicator of bad behaviour or bad activity or bad capability over here. We want to move that. We want to move that dial by a certain element, and to move that dial, these are the outliers we're going to have to change, or the core activity we're going to have to change. So it's really about how do you interpret what that data is telling you, and then what action do you want to take, and how do you measure that to ensure that that action is being taken.
Yeah, I like the emphasis you're making on it's not just about identifying vulnerabilities, it's actually your security team actually looking at the data and looking for those patterns and what's going on, as opposed to just saying we've got a list, we got to check them off.
Exactly.
There's one word of caution on that, David.
Go ahead. Yeah.
For the simple reason, most of the organization have the policy, as you said, what we do with low, medium, and high, right? As soon as we write somewhere in a policy that there are lows and we do something, we have to do something about it, right? If that we need to be careful that if we do this, and I'm fully with you, why do we look at lows at all? Medium is always questionable, but if we have it somewhere, we have to look at it, because otherwise, the auditor in me will come and say, "Got you, my friend. You said you do this, but you do that. You have a problem, right?" So therefore, totally with you. But if we go this down, or if anyone goes down this path, start top down, start from the policy, take it out there, take it out of the measurement, and then no one can come back and say, "Look, my friend, you haven't done the aggregation. Maybe it's 10 lows, gives you a medium somewhere, and you need to take care of it." Be very clear and from the outset that this is the way you operate.
I think it's okay to make the decision, provided you get the right buy and you take it through the risk decisioning process to say, well, my policy says all these different things. We're not going to measure everything, and we're going to accept risk and not address these certain things, because these are the 10 or 15 areas we want to focus on for the next year. We're going to start here with these high. So you might have something in there in low, because, and I think this is where the challenge becomes around, do you write policy to be ambitious and a stretch, or do you write policy to be just how you want to operate at a minimum? So I think there's a discussion there to be had.
But there's a problem already. A policy should only define for what we do, not how we do it, right? And so with that, if I see a policy which says, "Hey, we do low and we do this and this with it," I would already question the CISO and saying, why is this in a policy which is supposed to do what statements? But that's there is this one thing which is a governance and compliance topic, and then there is this risk way of doing things. And again, I think you're spot on, right? I would do exactly the same. I'm just having an audit background, that I would always get you with, if you don't have it somewhere written, and say, "Look here, this is," and that's what auditors often do, right?
But let's be, I think, but I'd be happy to have that conversation. I'd say yes, and I'd risk accept on behalf of the group all the lows. I'm not going to measure that. I don't care about that. Yes, it says that, but we're making that risk decision, and we've taken that through the risk governance process.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen. That's great. And we need to move on to our next one, unfortunately. Raf, let's jump on to asset inventory and why it's your favorite metric.
Yeah, I guess we've already touched on this in the different conversations here a little bit, right? Asset inventory, understanding what is on the network. And if I were to formulate a complete metric, it would be, well, can you tell me right now how many assets, how many devices are on your network? If you want to have this a little more specific, let's say everything that is addressable on the network, right? It's hard to have things somewhere standing offline. It doesn't really matter that much, but that's another question. There's other metrics to look at physical security of that. But how many assets do you have right now on your network? It's a very, very hard question, right? Like, how do you measure that? You've got to do it in an automatic way, but it's also probably one of the most fundamental metrics, as some of my colleagues here already said, right? I'm using this metric often as a context to other metrics, because as we just said, right, I can say I have 100 vulnerable machines. What does that mean? Even if they all have high vulnerabilities, well, out of how many? If I have 100,000 machines total, then that's not bad. But if I have 101 machines, that is really bad, right? So having that as a context, it's interesting how in this industry, we have been trying to get a handle of this for at least 2 decades. I remember in the early 2000s when the SIMs were hot, right? We had all these newcomers in the market. We had a whole asset management capability inside of the SIMs, right? You could model these assets, but we haven't completely cracked the nut yet on how to get this up-to-date inventory. There's a number of startups and more mature companies out there that are trying to solve this problem, but it's still a hard one, and pretty much nobody can tell me, guys correct me, how many assets they have on the network right now. It's just hard, right? Once you have sort of an inventory, you can go on and sort of improve upon this metric. Like if you know what's there, I would definitely try to figure out what's your control coverage, or like how certain are you that this number is the right one? How certain are you that there's not another subnet hidden somewhere that hosts another 52 machines, right, that you just don't know about yet? But that's something you can continue working on. In addition, once you have sort of an inventory, you can then continue and start doing the next step, which is, well, what is this machine? So categorize it in some way, right? Who is the owner of the machine? If something happens, you want to be able to go back to someone that's responsible for it. If you have a question about what this machine should be doing, well, hopefully the owner can tell you, right? And then with that, you can somewhat assign a criticality, and then full circle, you go into the vulnerability management, and you can actually have a criticality assigned with this thing that can then factor into the vulnerability conversation as well. Again, it's incredibly challenging, right? There's multiple ways to do this. You can do active discovery, you can scan things, you can do passive discovery by looking at log files to identify what machines are being mentioned in there and who your other machines are talking to and all these kinds of things. IoT is a very interesting beast to get a handle on, understanding what those machines are. You can classify your assets into managed versus unmanaged ones, right? You get into challenges of, well, what happens if a machine is not active some of the time, right? Like the roaming users, like how do you keep track of that inventory that, well, sometimes they're there, sometimes they're not. I might scan right now, well, the machine is not there. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? It's maybe just not addressable at the moment. There's all kinds of challenges you'll have to go through when you look at that. The other challenge here is that, and this was mentioned earlier, I think Andreas was very adamant about this, do not use Excel to manage your inventory, whatever it is, right? There's certain things where Excel is great at, but generally you want to have these things automated, right? Put it into systems that update and that you don't have to keep track of it, because if you have to do it manually, you're going to make mistakes. And again, also, this has been said by some other people in the panel, in general, when you're doing these kinds of things, you don't have to start with your whole organization of I don't know, 15 subsidiaries and I don't know how many networks and all kinds of outlier setups that you have. Start small, right? Figure out what is a critical network that you have. What are some critical machines you should have in inventory? Your Sarbanes-Oxley compliance, right, Andy? Like you want to know where your critical financial machines are and whatever has an impact on reporting your numbers. Well, go and figure out what those machines are and make sure you have an inventory and you keep very close tabs on that. And then the next question is, well, what does good look like? And that's a tough one. I don't know that I could tell you what is good in asset inventory, because, well, I would say if you know all the machines that you have, but how do you know? It's this unknown, right? Like, as I just said, maybe there is another subnet that one of your subsidiaries, they're running some other machines on with a different provider, a different address space. You have no clue, right? There is tools out there and vendor offerings that are trying to help you identify that kind of stuff from an external perspective and say, hey, it looks like this address range might actually belong to you as well. Are you sure you don't own that? But it's hard to define. And I think the best you can do is define that metric for yourself. What does good look like, right? And you should do this for everything anyway. It's like, what is good look like for whatever metric that you have? Maybe as a last point here is, I was at a previous company I worked for. We had a project to figure out what's our asset inventory. What are these machines out there? And as of an initial assessment, we had about 10,000 machines that we found, and that number would fluctuate a little bit up and down based on the approach we took to identify that. But then we tried to figure out who owns these things and what are they. I think we started with about a 70% that we had a pretty quick handle on what these machines are. That left us with 3,000 machines that initially the security team, the global security and IT teams could not figure out what they were. We were able to knock down a whole bunch of big chunks pretty quickly, like hundreds at a time. Oh, this is this dev group we haven't really accounted for. But we were left with about 500 machines, 500 that we didn't know what they're doing. Nobody claimed them. Nobody raised their hand. And this is emails to the whole company and reaching out to everyone. We literally went to and switched machines off to see if anyone was going to notice a difference. That is maybe where you have to go to get your assets under control, right? So I'll leave it with that.
Lovely. Thank you for that, Raf. Let's put it to the panel.
Look, I think I'm going to give a perspective. I know I'm giving lots of perspectives, but that's generally me anyway, anyone who knows me. Look, I think you're spot on, Raphael, in terms of defining what good looks like, but I'll frame it in terms of how do you get yourself, because we're never going to, I think it's so hard for us to see the entire environment and get the visibility 100% accurate at a point in time, right? Things spin up, things spin down. People add, particularly in a large, complex environment, if you're looking at 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 users, in 50, 60, 70 countries, in some of the environments that I've worked in, it's extremely tough, right? The question, I think, becomes, how do I get myself a level of confidence in terms of the insight that I have, right? That comes back to that risk appetite question to some degree, because there needs to be a cognizant decision that, yes, I'm not going to be able to see everything. But do I think that over a period of time, identify those assets that are sitting on the network, that could be then, a potential to be, vulnerable in some way, shape or form, or be exploitable in some way, shape or form? And I actually see metrics, and I want to come back to one of the panelists, I think it was Martin. He mentioned about some of the operational metrics, and I think it sort of ties into how do you get that level of confidence. For me, it's about, well, what is it you're trying to drive with the metric anyway? Like, if you're measuring it, you're trying to drive an outcome in some way, shape or form. So why are you measuring that? Is it the fact that from a asset inventory perspective, is it the fact that you're trying to drive, actually, we don't really understand, we don't have a good IT governance and control program, period, because we don't know what's coming on and coming off our network. I think the two metrics that Martin calls out in terms of, I know this is deviating from Raphael's metric a little bit, but I think it comes back to the point of why do we measure something, right? We measure something because we want to drive activity in some way, shape or form, whether that's a behavior change or whether that's an action. If you look at the couple of ones that he's called out, like the time taken between closing a ticket and QA of the ticket, the number of people working on incident ticket. Now, personally, I look at them, I don't see a lot of value in them, just at face value. So my question is, why do they feel like they were the right metrics to define to begin with? What activity or action or behavior were they trying to drive as a result of measuring it? Is it the fact we should have less people working on a ticket because our control should be better and we don't have it, we should be able to automate more? Was that the outcome that they were trying to achieve? Or was it not that thought through very well? And so
I think I agree with you to some degree, right? A lot of the metrics I would completely underwrite what you just said. But with the asset inventory, to me, that's a number that I need to know as context to all my other stuff, right? I don't necessarily need an action to it. I also agree with you in terms of like, well, look, we're not going to get to 100%, and you always know exactly how many you have, right? And we have to get a little more soft on those edges of how far we can go. But I think what we should do is say, look, in these areas, we accept that. In these areas here, I better know what we have, right?
I agree, and I think in terms of and let's make it really practical. So it's So we're not talking at a high level that people can take some action or think about the activity off the back of this. So let's look at the asset inventory one. You need to figure out how do you get yourself a high level of confidence that you're covering as much as you can to the best of your ability. Like, that's never going to be perfect, but you should be able to get an indicator as to whether or not you think you're way out, well, that's a problem, or are you just a little way out, right? And are you comfortable with that deviation that's going to come over time? And then, to your point, for those assets that we know about, I want to make sure I can measure X, Y, and Z 100% effectively and accurately for what I know about, right? So all these different metrics and points in times and decisions you're going to make around level of deviation that you will allow will start to give you a level of confidence across your overall security program. And I think that's really what we're trying to drive, because actually you're going to make some decisions off the back of that. Do I have confidence in my program? Where do I not have confidence in my program? And therefore, where do I need to invest time and activity and funds? I think that's the key.
One thing that's hard, I think, for everybody that has to do this measurement is it's rare that security has control over the inventory to start with. Mm-hmm. And how do you get IT or whoever controls that inventory to work with you to try to get it? Because you don't want to try to recreate the inventory. And that's one that it makes this a much harder task, but one that you have to face, and you've got to come to some degree of, I think, agreement with IT in this case.
But I think we have so much capability in terms of getting visibility and so much telemetry that we can actually challenge them, their process and their inventories.
I was just going to add, like, challenge really when you look at all these different discovery processes that you have, including like the third-party external scoring vendors and things like that, the vuln scanners that we all use and things like that. These are fundamentally discovery engines, right? And the output of that is, in fact, a challenge to the asset inventory owner of record, usually somebody in IT, where you're trying to challenge them around completion.
Given this fast-paced world we are in nowadays, right? We have microsegmentations. I can spin up a virtual machine in minutes, run one task. 3 hours later, the task is done. It's off. And in the 3 hours it was running, it was extremely vulnerable, dangerous whatsoever. I'm questioning since a couple of years if the approach of asset management in general is a race to which we can ever win. If this is at all achievable. And so, I think Rafi is spot on. Very interesting control. The more we know about it, the more we can do about it. But in a complex environment, I don't think this is feasible at all anymore.
Right. You're getting into an interesting conversation of where should security go, right? Mm-hmm. And we have been so asset and device centric. Andreas, you have been challenging this for a long time. I remember some conversations we've been having, 12, 13, 14 years ago, where you were saying, well, why don't we just protect the data and put that centrally somewhere and make sure the access is controlled, right? So to the conversation of starting to focus around data and not devices is probably where we need to move to, which is a humongous leap of attitude here, I guess.
Yep. Absolutely. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Raf, thank you very much for leading that segment. We have a bunch of questions that we now need to chuck in. So get ready to freeform this. Just feel like you can jump on whichever ones you'd like to. No order now. We'll just react to them as they came in. So the first one that came through was as follows. If I can pull it up because it's disappeared. In the COVID environment example, when the business overrules security controls such as multi-factor authentication for external access relating to remote working, how do we then pivot to a stance of advantage using metrics to reapply these controls and emphasize the importance?
At least get this started, at least anyway. First, at a high level, ultimately the business runs the business. So if they make a choice, in my mind, they've made a risk decision. And yes, we are expected as security professionals to manage it as best we can. But if they do make decisions and you've put your input, you got to live with it and you got to find a way to work around it. So that's my opening, at least, stance anyway.
But I think that just comes back to a risk decision, right? That's a risk. Yep. For me, that's very simple. security might say, look, this is security best practice, but security doesn't get to necessarily make the decision on how to your point, James, or Jim, business will make decisions on how they want to operate and the impact that they want, or the level of friction that they want to give to the end users. So for me, the real activity of that is not around measuring MFA. My challenge to that is, has that decision been made at the right level within the right organisation, across the organisation? Has it been through the risk governance process and the risk committees and heavily debated? Have you quantified and sized that risk appropriately? Who signed off and accepted that position for the organisation, right? And the security team is there to challenge it and drive that discussion, absolutely. But the organisation itself, actually, and I hate us using the term of the business, because actually, you know what, we are part of the business. We are part of the organisation that provides a service, right? So it's about us driving a conversation across the organisation and making sure the right people in the organisation understand the decision they're making, understand the risk that they're putting on the organisation, and are taking ownership and accountability of that decision. And the right checks and balances are there. For me, that's, when I read that question, that's that's how I think about it. And that's okay. It's okay for the security best practice not to be implemented, provided that decision's been made by the right people in the right organisation with the right...
Must be understood.
I agree with everything David said. The other part that I think there's an implied introspection that you ought to do on this, right? And I think about this a lot myself, is MFA, I think we agree that this provides higher confidence that a person is who they say they are. And I think for access to important data, I think we'd agree higher confidence around identity is a good thing. But part of this, it introduces friction, right? So the introspection question is there too much friction in the existing process? Is there something that we might be able to do to make this easier, right? And I'm not going to throw out vendor names here. I would just say there have been some interesting, like with the FIDO Alliance, for example, and the democratizing of many different kinds of authentication, and some of the things that rely on your smartphone for using the native fingerprint or face identification as a substitute for some of your traditional shark's tooth necklace hard tokens, right? Is that interesting? Does that reduce friction and still give you a lot of confidence? So I think part of when I read a question like that, I ask myself, what is it about the process of introducing friction? Why would the business make that decision? Is there a message here that we need to be heeding? And frankly, should we go ahead and do a little bit more research to modernize and make better, right? So I could give another analogy, but I'll probably stop here. So,
look, I think that's fair, right? And step-up authentication is only an authentication. It's actually not even validating if that identity should have access to that resource anyway. Like, is the access control around that resource correct? There's authentication, and then there's mapping of that identity to the resource. And what are the other signals we can take a look at, right? There's device signals, there's user behavior signals, there's network signals, there's data signals. So maybe for the most sensitive devices or the most sensitive assets or the most sensitive data, we'll introduce some friction where we, based on user behavior, have a signal that indicates this might be suspicious or this might not be the individual we want. So, how do we start to find that balance in that policy based on multiple data points, not just a blanket? Because actually, quite frankly, if it's a user accessing public data, we all have a data classification policy. If it's public data, it's meant to be out there. Why would I make it hard for them to get access to that? Right? But if it's really sensitive data, well, maybe there's other data points there we can look at. Again, it all comes back to giving ourselves that level of confidence we want in terms of the two ends of that transaction, whether it's a machine identity or whether it's a user identity, and what resource or data they're accessing.
And I think what we all learned now is that for cyber resiliency, we need to watch out for some of these stuff, right? To be more prepared in future. COVID at the beginning was a very extreme situation for many organizations, right? For others, not. For some of them, it was a real challenge. So, and I think what we will see, or what we're seeing already today now, that we see more and more controls in the resiliency space, where I said, how can we do such things quicker in future? How do we can ensure that things are continues to work? Business comes first and all that stuff. So I guess COVID has a good influence on these things to develop now a little bit more than just saying, oh, we are back on track in this and this time. So there's some good part of this, what's happening there.
Fantastic. Thank you for that one, gentlemen. We're going to move on to the next question now, because I'm very aware of time. I have just marked it as live, so you can go and have a look at it. Would you also classify accidental toxic combinations, i.e. ability to identify unprotected assets that also have access to PI data and are accessed by an individual with overweight privileges who has also failed a number of phishing tests? Quite a specific one there. So, Andy, probably over to you.
Yeah, take a shot at this. I wouldn't necessarily call it a toxic combination, but I would call it a problem. Yes. So, I think this is one of the smartest guys I ever met in security used to call some of these measurements signals that allowed you to walk towards the problem, right? And I think this is one of those walk towards the problem signals, which says that we it's like we need to talk, right? Let's find out what's going on with this particular user that may, are there other elements of the behavior or their day-to-day, do they essentially have a risky online lifestyle that might cause the possession of those privileges to be an issue? So that's how I'd view it. It's not strictly toxic, but it is definitely dangerous.
Well, it comes back to that point we were making before about culture, right? And you identify those high-risk users, and therefore, what consequence do you take for those high-risk users? Now, actually, if they failed a number of phishing tests, well, what do you do? What do you need to do to address that? Is that a matter of, okay, we're going to restrict your access to resources, across the organisation until we have a higher level of confidence in how you operate, right? So, there's so much to unpack in that question in itself. A number of unprotected assets that have access to PII. Well, that's a problem in itself that we probably need to dig into, right? So there's probably 3 or 4 trains of activity there when I read that question.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen. I'm going to move on to the next one now. So this one wasn't typed into the live question bit, so I'm going to have to try and read it out. Since we seem to cover the NIST stages so far, identify, protect, detect, we need another metric on respond and recover. Would be interested to see who thinks that is important and how to measure it. Tabletop exercises, red teaming, real instant responses. Would you like me to repeat that, or have you got it?
Yeah, no, I'll give you a perspective in terms of respond and recover. Well, recover, I think, comes back to things like how effectively have you tested your ITDR and your BCP plans, and how many of them actually were successful versus failed, because that's what respond and recover is about. In the event of an incident, how do you bring your environment back up? So how are you preparing for those elements? Respond and recover for me is around making sure that you can respond is measuring things like mean time to respond, right? So you've detected something, because we're asking, so we need another metric on respond. So respond is about response times, right? So you've detected something. How fast are you responding and containing? There's a difference between responding and containing an event. So it's come in, how quickly has activity spun up to take action to address what's been detected. When you've kicked off that activity, how long it's taken for you to contain that activity or that incident or that issue. In terms of recover, for me, it's around resiliency testing, and business continuity testing, ITDR testing. How many systems have you tried have you tested the backups for that have succeeded? How many end-to-end resiliency tests have you done across business processes and their systems and their third parties?
I would throw another component in there, the response, obviously how fast, but at what cost? Right? If I respond immediately, take all the systems offline, maybe take the whole company offline, that cost is huge, right? So I think that needs to be weighed against that too.
Great. Right, well, gentlemen, I think as we head towards our final couple of minutes, I wanted to first thank you all for taking the time out to come join us. A truly worldwide panel. I know you've all dialed in at various different time zones and locations, so we very much appreciate you taking whatever time of the day it is out to come and share your amazing expertise and backgrounds on the call with our wonderful attendees. So thank you all for that.